This is Michael Popok, Legal AF. The Department of Justice today fired back at Judge Cannon to try to school her on fundamentals of how grand juries work. Fired back at Stan Woodward, the lawyer who was bought and paid for by Donald Trump through a Save America PAC to represent 4 different people of interest, targets, or co-conspirators in Mar-a-Lago, and ultimately fire back at Donald Trump by extension. What happened and why? That's what this hot take's about. Let's start with what happened. The Stan Woodward, the lawyer bought and paid for by Donald Trump, has been representing 2 former executive assistants, one of Donald Trump and one of Melania Trump, representing co-conspirator indicted Walt Nauta, and had at one time represented Jose Taveras, the IT director. Why is he important? Because as we know from the later superseding indictment, Jose Taveras finally came clean. He first lied to the grand jury when he was represented by Stan Woodward, and then when he got a lawyer that is not controlled by Donald Trump, a public defender, Taveras changed his tune, recanted his testimony, told the truth about the conspiracy to delete the video surveillance footage, the cameras that overlooked all areas of Mar-a-Lago, and that obviously showed Walt Nauta, now co-conspirator Carlos de Oliveira, and this guy, employee number 4, but we know better as Jose Taveras, IT head. And what happened is when he was represented by the Trump guy, the Trump lawyer, Stan Woodward, he lied to the grand jury in March when he testified in the District of Columbia, which is where the grand jury was investigating what was going on at Mar-a-Lago. He went there, he lied. He told them he didn't remember a conversation about deleting the surveillance video that Donald Trump instigated, that the boss wanted to happen, and that conversation took place with Walt Nauta and Carlos de Oliveira. Remember, the government already had the text messages and emails and had not yet the surveillance video, but was getting close to it about that conspiracy. So they knew that he had perjured himself. He had lied in front of the grand jury in the District of Columbia. So in the timeline that's presented in the papers, and what the government is trying to do at this hearing about the conflict of interest is to get Walt Nauta, his lawyer, Stan Woodward, to drop out and recognize that there's a conflict of interest and he can't represent these multiple people. But apparently Stan Woodward has never seen a conflict of interest that he can't figure out a way around, especially when he's getting paid by Donald Trump and improperly influencing the witness testimony of people, as we've always suspected, like the IT worker. And that is Exhibit A that the government used today in its filing as a further request for the what's called in Miami or Florida, the Garcia hearing, to have the judge look into the conflicts of interest. And here's the timeline that was presented. I'm gonna actually read it to you. And the bottom line is that the Department of Justice is calling Stan Woodward a liar, and calling Stan Woodward somebody who is improperly obstructing justice because he's not allowing people like his client, Taveras, properly and truthfully testify. That only happens, as the government points out, when that guy gets his own lawyer and says everything I just said to the grand jury in March is false. Here's the truth, gets immunity, and then we get the superseding indictment that tells the story about the attempt to delete the server containing the surveillance video. And that's all in gory detail in 12 pages filed by the federal government. And while they're at it, because the judge brought up the issue of why do you have multiple grand juries and how do multiple grand juries work when the indictment came out of Florida, because she raised that issue, they said, well, you know what, Judge, we'll school you on that as well, because you seem to have gotten off, kind of ahead of yourself and over your skis about how grand juries work. So let's do a tutorial on that while we're at it. And I'll go over that point as well here. So here's how the government describes the case and how we got to Mr. Taveras getting a new lawyer, getting away from Mr. Woodward, and then making the decision to tell the truth. This is a quote from the brief on page 2. During these investigations, the government gathered evidence that Trump employee Carlos de Oliveira who is the maintenance worker, tried to enlist the director of information technology from Mar-a-Lago, known as Trump employee number 4, but that's Mr. Tavares, to delete Mar-a-Lago security footage after the grand jury in District of Columbia had issued a subpoena for the footage. That's a no-no. You don't delete and destroy evidence and spoliate evidence after somebody asks for it, like a grand jury or a judge with a subpoena or search warrant. As set forth in the government's original motion, before Trump employee number 4 and his appearance before the grand jury in the District of Columbia. Now that's important because that's where Tavares gave his testimony, District of Columbia. So all issues about any conflict of interest with Tavares should have properly taken place in the District of Columbia. There, the government continues, the government informed Mr. Woodward, right, the Save America PAC lawyer for Donald Trump representing Mr. Tavares, that his concurrent representation of both Mr. Tavares and Walt Nauta raised a potential conflict of interest. But Mr. Woodward responded that he did not have a reason to believe that his concurrent representation, right, representing 2 clients at the same time, raised a conflict of interest. Okay, so then the government put on Mr. Tavares in March of 2023 in front of the grand jury, and he claimed he couldn't remember a darn thing as it relates to the surveillance video or the footage at Mar-a-Lago, the government knowing that that was false but having to develop further evidence. And in the same grand jury, De Oliveira likewise denied that he had any contact with Mr. Tavares regarding the security footage. Again, the government has a working theory that's a lie, doesn't have the goods yet, doesn't have the evidence. We fast forward under the filing to June 8th of 2023, when a grand jury in Florida now returned the 38-count indictment against Trump and Walt Nauta, but doesn't. And this is now a strategic coup by, speaking of coups, by Jack Smith. He purposely let out, did not put in to the original indictment any mention of the security footage deletion conspiracy because he didn't have his cake baked yet. He didn't have all the testimony he needed. They were still working Tavares. They were still working De Oliveira. They were still working Nauta, right, to try to get one of them to flip. So they weren't ready yet. And they knew if they got one to flip, they'd come back with a superseding indictment. That's exactly what had happens. First thing they needed to have happen, as outlined on page 3 of the reply, is that they needed the Florida grand jury to issue search warrants for the security footage, or subpoenas for the security footage that they knew the government would show De Oliveira, Walt Nauta, and Tavares surreptitiously under cover of darkness in the hidden chambers of Mar-a-Lago having this conversation, even if they just had it on video without the audio. As the year progresses, it's so important to stay on top of your mental health and fitness. We here at Legal AF on the MeidasTouch Network are working as fast as we can to bring you the latest legal and political news updates. So we know we have to stay sharp between the ears at all times. Frankly, life gets, what's the word I'm searching for? Busy. And sometimes you end up sacrificing good foods and snacks for unhealthy ones strictly because they may seem more convenient. Whether at the gym, on the go, or between meals with the family, Mosh protein bars are the smart snack to keep your brain and body fit, fueled, and feeling good. With 6 delicious flavors, each Mosh bar comes packed with 12 grams of protein and is made with ingredients that support brain health like ashwagandha, lion's mane, collagen, and omega-3s. At 160 calories and only 1 gram of sugar, Mosh protein bars are the guilt-free snack your brain and body will crave. Your brain is your number one tool, which is why Mosh protein bars were mindfully formulated by some of the top neuroscientists and functional nutritionists. Founded by Patrick Schwarzenegger and Maria Shriver, Mosh is a mission-driven brain health and wellness company that donates a portion of all proceeds to support women's brain research through the Women's Alzheimer's Movement at Cleveland Clinic. I absolutely love Mosh protein bars. They're delicious and savory, and the smart snack to keep your brain and body fit, fueled, and feeling good. We're constantly doing different videos and hot takes and podcasts here on the MeidasTouch Network, so I'm able to enjoy Mosh protein bars easily and enjoyably between tasks. Don't settle for a mediocre snack when you can nourish your body and mind with the fuel it needs to succeed. So whether you're at the gym, on the go, or just living your best life, Mosh protein bars will keep your brain and body fit, fueled, and feeling good. Head to moshlife.com/legalaf to save 20% off plus free shipping on your first 6-count trial pack. That's 20% off plus free shipping on your first 6-count trial pack, which includes all 6 mouth-watering flavors. MOSHLIFE.com/legalaf. And so on June 29 and July 11th, the grand jury in Florida issued those subpoenas for the footage. Once they got their hands on the footage, the government on June 20th, 2023, advised Taveras through his lawyer, Mr. Woodward, that he was now the target of a grand jury investigation in the District of Columbia for perjury, that he had perjured himself when he testified to that District of Columbia grand jury in violation of federal criminal law. Once he got the target letter, Taveras knew he was sunk. And that's when the government decided to lend him a hand, right? As only the government can, right? The government is my enemy until I need a friend. The government lent Mr. Taveras a hand and said, you might have a conflict of interest, Mr. Woodward, because now he's going to have to, one of your clients is going to have to change his testimony about not knowing anything about a discussion with your other client, Mr. Nauda, right? Pitting them against each other. And that's a crystallized conflict of interest that can't be maintained. We need to have a hearing about it. We're bringing this issue to the chief judge of the grand juries in the District of Columbia, Judge Boasberg. Judge Boasberg took one look at this problem and decided to hold a hearing, but get Mr. Taveras his own independent law firm or his own counsel. This is the first time that Taveras had his own independent counsel, not bought and paid for by Donald Trump in the entire proceeding. And we know what happens next. The judge assigns the first chief federal public defender, right? Taxpayer dollars, to represent Mr. Taveras. They have a meeting, and at that meeting, Mr. Taveras bravely and smartly makes 2 quick decisions. I want this guy to represent me, or this person to represent me, the first chief public defender for the District of Columbia, and I'm going to change my testimony. So that is what this motion, this reply brief, brings to the court's attention in a way that even Judge Cannon, or 3 blind mice, could figure this out. That it was only after Taveras got out from under the thumb of Donald Trump through Stan Woodward being paid by the PAC did he come clean and give proper testimony, truthful testimony, to avoid prosecution. That was the moment. We talked about it on Legal AF on the MeidasTouch Network when Taveras saw the indictment, saw it was missing the security camera conspiracy, but knew it was coming after he got his target letter. And now, you know, the conversation went this way. This is my artist rendering. Department of Justice to Stan Woodward. Okay, your guy's not in the current indictment. He's going to be in the superseding indictment. He can either get on board or he can be indicted. And Woodward, who loves when his clients get indicted, right? He met with the Department of Justice before Walt Nauta was indicted when they offered Walt Nauta a deal. And instead of taking the deal and cutting the deal in the best interest of his clients, he instead threw sand in the eyes of the Department of Justice, went to the media and said he didn't like the way the meeting went with Jay Bratt from the Department of Justice. They were mean to him. They mentioned that maybe if you wanted to be a judge, Mr. Woodward, as you said you did in the District of Columbia, you might want to be nicer with the Department of Justice. Oh, they were mean, Judge. And he didn't cut the deal for Walt Nauta, who got indicted 2 weeks later. So if you want to get indicted, hire Stan Woodward. If you want to cut a deal and save yourself, don't hire Stan Woodward. That's the takeaway from this hot take. And so now Mr. Taveras has the first chief public defender representing him and cut a deal. a full immunity deal in return for full and complete cooperation and truthful testimony. That then led to the actual superseding indictment that came out on the issue. Now that they've done that, now that you've understood the hearing with Chief Judge Boasberg up in District of Columbia, the indictment coming out in Florida, the reason that the target letter told Taveras that he was the target of a criminal investigation up in the District of Columbia, that's because he lied in the District of Columbia. And now you know as much as a federal judge in Fort Pierce, Florida, because you actually know more than her, because she could not figure out why there were multiple grand juries and what they were doing and why they were being used. And so they gave the judge a tutorial about how grand juries work. And I'm not making this up. In footnote 1 on page 7 of their briefing, the government says Walt Nauta, which is really Stan Woodward, also errs to the extent he suggests that the government's earlier use of the grand jury in the District of Columbia was improper simply because the government ultimately brought charges in Florida. Courts have long recognized that the scope of the grand jury's inquiries is not to be limited narrowly by questions of propriety or forecasts, predictions of the probable result of the investigation, or by doubts whether any particular individual will be found properly subject to an accusation of a crime, because the identity of the offender and the precise nature of the offense, if there be one, normally are developed at the conclusion of the grand jury's labor, not at the beginning. In other words, Judge, we didn't know where this was going to lead. There was just as much reason to open the grand jury in the District of Columbia as there was in Florida, because both districts encompass the conduct. This is their continuation of footnote 1, reminding the judge the bad conduct span 2 different jurisdictions. So it's okay to have a grand jury in one and the other, right? And if there was an indictment of Nauta, an indictment of Taveras, the IT worker, and the maintenance worker, De Oliveira, for lying to the DC grand jury, they'd be indicted in DC. But they're also being sued or prosecuted in Florida for obstruction of justice and lying and trying to delete the servers and all of that, because that happened in Florida, and that's the proper venue or location for that indictment. And they had to spend another 3 pages of ink to teach the judge, and I'm not making this up, Grand Jury 101, about the proper use of the grand jury. Now this thing is fully briefed, meaning the issue is fully squarely before the judge, and the judge, it is your next move. What's she going to do now? Now she's going to hold a hearing. I think they've answered properly, and I'll do a deeper dive on the grand jury thing. They properly answered the question for the Department of Justice to the judge, why we had 2 grand juries, and the fact that the one in D.C., we already put out of business, going out of business at the last week. And they have now told the judge in no uncertain terms, you see what happens when Donald Trump manipulates legal representation and uses his Save America PAC to hire people bought and paid for? They are beholden to him, not to the client's best interest. And this undermines the credibility. This is why they did it. Because Woodward forced them to have this Garcia hearing, and Woodward, the lawyer, refused to recognize the conflict of interest that was staring him in the face, they made him pay. And that's the beauty of Jack Smith. They made him pay. And they gave him a knockout punch and said, yeah, you want us to describe everything that went on here? We'll also tell the judge that your credibility is at risk and undermined, because as soon as Mr. Taveras got about as far away from you as possible as a lawyer and got an independent lawyer, he admitted that he committed perjury in front of the grand jury in March while he was your client, and he changed his tune, told us the truth, which allowed us to add a new count in the superseding indictment and bring in Mr. De Oliveira with the cooperation of Mr. Taveras, the IT worker, and now claim there was a second conspiracy to obstruct justice, to destroy evidence, led by Donald Trump, the boss, giving instructions to his maintenance worker on a 24-minute phone call, the longest phone call in recorded history between a former president and a maintenance worker, and Walt Nauta, his butler, and now the cooperating, non-indicted, fully immune from prosecution, Jose Taveras. None of that would have been possible if Donald Trump was successful in his plot to have all these witnesses represented by one guy or one person bought and paid for by the Save America PAC. It's only when they wriggled their way free and the Department of Justice gave them an escape route, right? They basically held it out to Tavares and said, you know what, I'll make it easy on you. We'll do a hearing up in D.C. with Chief Judge Boasberg. He'll assign you a new lawyer. Then you can decide independently whether you want to stay with the Trump-bought lawyer, Mr. Woodward, or not. And of course, it went right the way the government wanted. And Mr. Tavares took the bait and escaped to freedom on July the 5th when that new testimony came out, and then the superseding indictment followed right on the heels of that. That is the exploder. That's the breakdown here on this hot take. Only one place, the MeidasTouch Network. If you like hot takes, who doesn't like hot takes? Then you can put them all together and follow us on Wednesdays and Saturdays when we do 4 or 5 of these stories with co-anchors. So I'm not just talking to a ring light and a microphone and a camera. You can watch me talk also and do this kind of analysis with Karen Friedman Kniflo and Ben Meiselas Wednesdays and Saturdays only on the MeidasTouch Network, on audio everywhere you get audio, on the video version of it, on the recorded version of it, on the MeidasTouch YouTube channel, all free to subscribe. Follow me, Michael Popok, at all things social media at MS Popok. Until the next hot take, this is Michael Popok, Legal AF.
Hey Meidas Mighty, love this report? Continue the conversation by following us on Instagram at MeidasTouch to keep up with the most important news of the day. What are you waiting for? Follow us now.